Can a Christian remarry after divorce? It's one of the most debated questions in Christianity today. While churches often disagree, it's worth asking another question. How did the earliest Christians, the generations closest to the apostles, understand the teachings of Jesus? Let's begin with Christ himself. In Matthew 19, Jesus was asked why Moses allowed divorce. He replied, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so." Jesus then returned to God's original design for marriage. He said, "Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." For Jesus, marriage was intended to be a lifelong covenant. The Apostle Paul teaches the same principle in 1 Corinthians 7. He writes, "A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband." Paul gives only two options after separation: remain unmarried or be reconciled. Later he explains why. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to marry whom she wishes, only in the Lord. According to Paul, death, not divorce, ends the marriage covenant. So how did the earliest Christians understand these passages? The historical record is surprisingly consistent. Around AD 150, Hermas wrote that remarriage after the death of a spouse was not sinful, although remaining single was considered even more honorable before God. About 25 years later, Athenagoras explained that Christians should be content with one marriage. He argued that Christ did not permit a man to divorce his wife and marry another, emphasizing the lifelong nature of marriage. Around AD 180, Irenaeus referred to the Samaritan woman as someone who had lived immorally through many marriages, reflecting the seriousness with which early Christians viewed repeated unions. In the early 3rd century, Tertullian strongly opposed remarriage after divorce. Later, after joining the Montanist movement, he adopted an even stricter position, arguing that Christians should not remarry even after becoming widowed. While that stricter view was not accepted by the whole church, his opposition to remarriage after divorce reflected a belief shared by many early Christians. Around AD 245, Origen criticized certain church leaders for allowing women to remarry while their husbands were still alive. He said this practice contradicted the teaching of Scripture. Origen wrote that a woman whose husband was still living became an adulteress if she married another man. Likewise, the man who married a divorced woman committed adultery according to the words of Jesus. Near the end of the 3rd century, Methodius acknowledged that Paul allowed remarriage after the death of a spouse, while still teaching that remaining single was the higher calling. Finally, the Apostolic Constitutions, compiled around AD 390, permitted remarriage after widowhood, especially for younger widows, but continued to uphold lifelong faithfulness as God's ideal. When we step back and look at all these writings together, a clear pattern emerges. The earliest Christians generally made a distinction between widowhood and divorce. If a spouse had died, remarriage was usually permitted based on Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 7. But if a spouse was still living, remarriage after divorce was widely understood to be contrary to Christ's words. There were differences about whether widows should remarry. Some encouraged lifelong singleness, while others accepted remarriage. But there was remarkable agreement that marriage was a covenant lasting until death. This doesn't mean every Christian today interprets these passages the same way. Many sincere believers understand Jesus' exception clause in Matthew 19 differently, and different traditions have reached different conclusions. However, the testimony of the early church is difficult to ignore. Those living closest to the time of the apostles overwhelmingly understood Jesus' teaching to mean that the marriage bond remained until death. Whether or not we agree with every conclusion they reached, their witness reminds us of something our culture often forgets. Marriage is more than a legal contract. It is a sacred covenant established by God, intended to reflect Christ's faithful and enduring love for His church.